there's this saying that the best camera is the one you have with you. The best programming language is the one you know. What your app does is just multiple API calls to ChatGPT. Let's be real. These guys aren't writing their own machine learning models. They aren't building anything from scratch. So why the hell do you need microservices?
So this discussion is what, Odie?
Yes, so this discussion is about like technology choices, right, for startups. How do you decide what technology stack you use? Do you just pick something because everybody else is doing it? And you see this a lot in like young startups where they hear, oh, this startup is using this technology stack and they've raised Series A funding of this amount of money, adding some kind of halo status to like the specific technologies that different startups use. So in your opinion, let's start with you, Scott. Like, do you think that the technology stack matters for startups?
All right,
And
so
if
let's try
so,
to.
like, what criteria do you use to pick them?
All right, so let's try to have a goal of getting this under 30 minutes. Ready, set, go. All right. So the answer is technology stack does matter. And to elaborate, take into consideration kind of the catch 22.
Mm-hmm.
You're building a business that is supposed to outlast the developers that are currently building it. Okay.
Okay.
Which means that the business is incentivized to use a technology that is safe and that is going to be around with great likelihood. Okay. So what's the catch
Okay.
22? Well, the catch 22 is there's one thing to be able to more or less have no problem selecting from a pool of developers to maintain your the technical aspects of your business.
Okay.
But what kind of developers do you want to attract to maintain the technical aspects of your business? And I would say that technology is very relevant for that. If we're talking about technology in regards to languages, then you pick your language, you pick your company, you pick the culture, I would argue, and that's debatable. But I will say that, and we kind of talked about this before. I've never, ever, ever met any F sharp developer, any Clojure developer, any Scala developer that only knows F sharp, only knows Clojure, or only knows Scala ever.
Okay.
99.9% probability they're a polyglot. 99.9% probability that they have demonstrated that software development is more than their 9 to 5. They're interested in being more productive, more effective, more efficient at work, more or less with efficiency, but more productive. Okay.
Hmm.
You pick your language, you pick your camp, you pick your community. I picked F sharp.
Okay.
I met you, Odie, right?
True.
I don't think enterprise organizations understand this or even have had that revelation. This goes back to what Jamie Edwards was discussing, in which incentives, what incentivizes. I feel like I'm breaking that word. Developers.
Hmm.
What is the incentives of a middle manager, right?
Okay.
And I would argue it's to get favorable reviews every 6 months or every 12 months, and kind of ignoring the long term strategic objectives of the business, because that's not what they're being measured on, or that's not what the focus or the priorities for them being measured. I'll pause.
So, like, I will push back on that a little bit, right? Um, you see, technology stack affects everything in a business. It affects your hiring, it affects your talent pool, it affects your support, it affects your consultants, hiring consultants. It affects a lot of things, right? And if you pick a language, I don't want to throw F sharp under the bus because this applies to all functional languages, not even just F sharp. But if you pick a functional language, for example, the talent pool is more concentrated, meaning that you have a smaller a smaller set of people to pick from, but those people are usually top tier talent. So, and as a startup, can you
No, no,
afford to
no.
pay
Let's
those
let's
people?
let's go back for a second. Top tier
Okay.
talent means what?
Top tier talent means the person is probably more than 5 years experienced. It means that the person is probably has a lot of experience developing, like you said, is a polyglot, developing in other languages and things like that.
Top tier talent means that they are a NX developer. They are two times, three times, maybe four
Mm-hmm.
times more productive than your mainstream developer. Okay, I wanted to clarify that if you agree or not.
Yeah. Yeah. No, no, I agree. We can go with that definition, right? But but that N tier NX developer also means that they're going to earn you NX money as well. Like you would need to pay NX money. And as a startup, you may not necessarily have that kind of money. Instead, what some startups do, yeah, think about it. What many
I thought
startups
about
do
it. I already
is
have my rebuttal, but I'm listening.
okay, so what many startups do is they pick a language that is very common that they can get cheap labor for, something like JavaScript or TypeScript. And then they employ these NX developers you're talking about, maybe just one or two of them, right, who have plenty of experience, and let those guys spearhead like the development efforts, and then have the quote unquote junior, cheaper developers, support that NX developer, right? So again, you see startups do this a lot. They maybe the NX developer in question could be the founder and maybe a few other key engineers, and then they will have lots and lots of quote unquote junior developers that they are paying to get the job done. Right. The same thing happens with things like support. Right. Getting support, getting help, right? So the junior developers need to figure something out. They don't need to do much. Like there's plethora of tutorials on YouTube. There's plethora of books they can read and stuff like that. So my point, the point I'm getting at is that you know, one strategy which is valid, right, is essentially what you're saying. Get a very good language which has a very good community around it. Get those NX developers to work on the project or work on the solution and so on and so forth. And then you only need like three or four of these guys to move mountains. I get that. But that is not a strategy many startups follow, right? Is so another strategy that startups follow is use a technology that's common, use a technology that's well known, manage to lock of these NX developers and hire as many developers as you can who are junior developers in this language that is very common, a C sharp, a Java, a JavaScript or TypeScript or the case may be. And I'm saying that that is also a valid strategy as well. So what's your rebuttal?
Are we talking about startups or are we talking about trying to conceive if a startup should even exist? So, for example, a
Mm-hmm.
startup, I would think, has already demonstrated that based on a set of experiments, a business can be formed. Is that a true statement?
Yeah, that's a true statement.
Okay. So, the highest priority, I think, in a startup would be getting to market.
Correct. Yes.
If that's the highest priority, then surely the technology that's focused on that priority only to get to market would would matter. So we're not talking about 3 years down the line. We're talking about finding product market fit. Can we get customers? Quickly learn lessons, adapt. And I would say that whatever technology gets you there faster and whatever technology attracts the people that want to spend the finite time that they have left on this earth towards delivering your dream and get them on your team faster, I would argue that matters more than anything. And then once you have money coming in, then you can start being more strategic and more mainstream with planning out technology that is going to have, I don't know, attract a wider pool. But then there's still other factors that you have to take into consideration, right? Would it make sense for me to launch a startup and use PHP? Would it?
Well, no.
No, no, no. You said no, so then I'm going to follow up with why
Hold
not?
on. I want to explain. So, granted, there are a lot of PHP developers, but I would argue that there are just as many Node.js developers as there are PHP developers. In fact, I even think that there are more Node.js developers, right? There's more Node.js knowledge than there is for PHP at this point in time. 10 years ago, that was different, but that's not the case today, right? So if you're going to go with a language like PHP, and there is another language just as popular as PHP, but slightly better, that would make more sense to do it that way than PHP. PHP is just bad in all dimensions. It's bad as a language, it's bad as a technology, it's bad, from a longevity standpoint. It's also bad from any metric you want to use. It's just objectively bad, right? Whereas something like a Node.js, something like a C sharp, right, isn't as bad as PHP in the technology itself, and you get all the benefits of picking a PHP in the first place.
So I would argue that, or I was steering towards, there's multiple factors to what you want to start up to achieve. So as much as I said that I believe that you want to be able to get to the marketplace as quickly as possible and start adapting to marketplace conditions,
Mhm.
and that's more tactical, right? That
Yeah.
is tactical. It's not strategic. We're not looking 36 months out. We're not looking 10 years out, right?
Mhm.
At the same time, in our discussion about security, you don't want to completely ignore it. You want to respect it as a factor, but you also want to acknowledge that it's not a high priority. So I'll try to get to whatever I'm trying to get to.
Mhm.
You have to ask you have to ask the question: what is the probability that the stack that we're using, or one of the tools within the stack that we're using, is going to be deprecated, aka start losing support? And is that something we're okay with 36 months from now, when when hopefully we are in the market and we have solidified our customers or established our customers? That question, it's not as relevant as getting to the marketplace now to prove a point and being first to market and take
Mhm.
advantage of the network effect, but it's something that you should keep in your back pocket. And I'll pause.
Correct. No, no, no. You're right about that, right? In the sense that it's something you have to consider. You can't just decide to use COBOL for your startup because you have a bunch of COBOL developers who, to them, developing the application will be super easy and all of that stuff, right? Going back to your first question or your first statement of whatever gets you to the customer the quickest is the one you should pick. That is true, but that also depends on the team you have, right? If you have a bunch of retired F sharp developers coming together and they want to build something, then F sharp is the fastest way to get to market, right? Even though the generally people maybe more, even though generally people are more conversant with a language like Java or whatever. But if all your developers decide to pick Java, or if somebody high up, let's say you are like a team of 4 or 5 developers who have knowledge with .NET, and you decide to pick Java, you're going to spend just as much time working in Java as you would if, say, you pick what you're familiar with. There's this saying that the best camera is the one you have with you. The best programming language is the one you know, right? So that's how I see it, right? The one you know and the one you can get developers to work on quickly. But let's say for example, you're just starting from scratch. You don't know anybody. You just want to quickly hire people and get something done as quickly as possible. I will make the argument that you will do yourself a disservice. If your goal is getting to market as quickly as possible, you're doing yourself a disservice by picking any other language other than JavaScript, for example, or even C Sharp to some extent is kind of gimped, right? JavaScript is what everybody is using. Like the chances of you getting 10 JavaScript developers is like very easy. But how easy it is for you to get 10 F Sharp developers on your team, right?
Well, there's
Because
another question that
yeah,
needs to be
go ahead.
asked.
Hmm.
Even if you get whatever arbitrary language of developers on your team, what is the likelihood that that part of the system or the system needs to be rewritten because of the lack of maintainability of
But
that language, lack of constraints that that language exposes for long-term maintainability?
exactly, but that's a different conversation at that point. That's the conversation of maintainability, long-term sustenance. That's not the original conversation we had. The original
No, no,
conversation
no,
was
no. It goes back.
no,
It
no,
goes
no.
back.
Like think about it, right? If I want to have a website up tomorrow that accepts users' details, is able to store it and maybe display it and blah blah blah. If that is my goal and I needed to get maybe I'm not building it by myself. I need to have a team of people build it. I'm telling you right now, you go cloud, you go with something like AWS Lambda or Netlify or something like that. You go JavaScript and you will have an app in no time split. Now you are trading off a lot of long-term maintainability, which is what you're talking about, for that initial speed. So if you imagine you had a graph of speed versus effort, right? These languages I just mentioned have like the maximum speed initially, and then the amount of effort just grows exponentially from that point. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So
What?
the yeah, okay. So the point I'm getting at is that the goal that from being a good technical leader, right, involves weighing the pros of that initial ramp up speed with the cons of the long term exponential efforts that it would take to make even the simplest of features because of, like you said, the lack of constraints in the language.
Okay.
Yeah. So my point is that if that is your goal, then yes, go ahead and use those ones. But that is not like the thing we said with security. It's a good idea, but it's one that breaks down very quickly. A good example is Twitter that started with Ruby on Rails, right? Because with Ruby on Rails, right, Ruby on Rails is another example where it's pretty much if you wanted an app tomorrow, it's pretty much a questionnaire or like a prompt, a set of prompts. Oh, do you want this? Add this controller. It will add everything for you: UI, buttons, input, validation, and all of that stuff. But the moment you want to scale it, you run into bottlenecks. The moment you want to make even the slightest of modification, the moment you want to change how certain things work, or I want to change how the authentication works in this piece, all of a sudden now you are spending exponential effort for something that should have been built in and made easy to do, right? Like, improving the performance should be something that should be okay. I can just go to the hotspots and change a few things and get faster performance. Does that make sense?
It does.
Yeah.
Okay. We're at 20 minutes.
So for me though, like I just said earlier, it's a good thing to think about, but I feel like it's the wrong metric, right? Because like you said, there are so many things that are involved. How good is the language in such a way that you don't get into this issue of having exponential efforts to make even the simplest of changes? How easy it is for you to get developers to work on that project? What is your long-term strategy for how you plan to scale the business? Because ultimately, if it's successful, the business needs to scale. And how do you scale quickly, right? That is things you need to consider when selecting a technology stack.
Okay. So let's explore that.
Okay.
Who says that when you select a technology stack, that the entire business every component of that business is going to be based on that technology stack. Is there such thing as having a
Mm.
technology stack that is Java, .NET, Elm, and an entire language spectrum that that is basically part of some type of microservice architecture? Like, are we really constrained to a stack, or is that really just a constraint that we literally just frame this discussion under? Um, if we think about the actual architecture and we think about polyglots, I guess I'm asking the question: how relevant is technology if you don't put constraints on it and you leave it up and we start mapping it to the organization to pick and choose as long as they can map it to business objectives versus making it revolve around tools?
So this will bring us, this will take us down another road I don't want to go down, which is this whole startups and microservices, because I could rant for 45 minutes nonstop if if you let me.
Rant for
Um,
5 minutes.
okay, let me compress it. No startup should ever have anything to do with microservices. I'm sorry. If you're still a startup, build a freaking monolith. 100%. Microservices is not for everybody. Microservices is for the Amazons of the world, the Microsofts of the world, the Facebooks of the world that has multiple teams, all separated, managing multiple things. Enterprises, go ahead and do your microservices. But as a startup, you have zero business doing a microservice. And the reason you have zero business doing a microservice is that we've been sold a lie in this industry. And the lie we've been sold is that, oh, one machine is not powerful enough. No, one machine is powerful enough to serve a good portion of most of the applications or the most of the web apps, right, that exist out there. Yeah, go ahead.
Odie, what was the what is the motivation for a microservice architecture?
I don't want to, I could jump to it, but I don't want to. Okay, so the main motivation that I was told, right, was a few things. One, separation of concerns. Two, horizontal scaling. Um, you know,
No,
okay, what is it?
no, no, no. The motivation for a microservice architecture
Mm-hmm,
is to scale people in the development of that system, right? It's so, for example, every once in a while I hear this whole thing about a two pizza team or whatever, but
mm-hmm,
I thought that it was more focused or aligned with Conway's law, right? In
mm-hmm,
which, depending on the amount of people that the startup requires to get to the marketplace as soon as
mm-hmm,
possible, could be a factor on if you're going to have a monolith or a microservice system. So, for
mm-hmm.
example, and you would probably be in a better position to educate me on this because I honestly don't know. I am ignorant. The majority of startups, probably probably 95% of them, absolutely go with the monolith. Don't even question. Like, is your product or service that complicated that it warrants that many people to be involved to stand up that platform? Is it even a platform, right? However, what if the product is a cloud computing platform? Would that still make sense to be a monolith? What if it's something, and it's a low probability, but for the low, we're talking about exceptions. I believe it's healthy for us to discuss exceptions if we're making an argument for anything.
Mm-hmm.
Um, then maybe that would be an argument for entertaining polyglots and entertaining different teams that have autonomy to pick or choose their own stack to contribute to the platform that needs to be realized at a certain date. I'm just throwing it
So,
out there.
let me first answer your first question. The answer is almost zero. How many startups do you know are actually building very serious cloud computing platforms. Like, how do you, first question is, how do you,
Everybody now, I literally just got off of Y Combinator matchmaking, and the answer is right now, I would argue two-thirds of startups are now in the AI business, or they want to be in
okay,
the AI business.
okay. Now, the AI business in question, right? What does it involve? It's just API calls to ChatGPT. Why do you need multiple microservices? Let's face it. You aren't hosting the GPUs. You aren't hosting the compute. You aren't the one writing the distributed. That's if it's even distributed at all, right? What your app does is just multiple API calls to ChatGPT. Let's be real. These guys aren't writing their own machine learning models. They aren't building anything from scratch. So why the hell do you need microservices?
Right. If we're talking about the clients that are relying on a facade type platform like ChatGPT or Bard or whatever, yes,
Mhm.
you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
We're talking about exceptions, so that would say, do we have the expectation that ChatGPT was built as a monolith? It needs
Okay.
to.
Okay. Let's pick the chat GPT, right?
Okay, we're talking about
Chat,
exceptions, but I
yeah,
see
yeah,
you,
yeah,
your
sure.
hair is standing up.
Yeah. So think about it, right?
All right.
If I'm building chat GPT, it's broken into two parts. There is the it's services that okay, there's the chat GPT website itself, and then there is this secret sauce that it does, right? There is the chat GPT AI that you parallelize and you call it and blah 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 blah, right? So every time somebody types something into chat GPT, it calls one of those AI instances, if you will, that does the inference and gives them a result and they process it and so on and so forth. Now think about it. The main website itself, openai.chat.com, doesn't need to be a microservice. It can be a single server, right? It could be. So let's break apart the terminology. When I say single server, I mean like single service. That single service can be replicated and scaled horizontally if you want, if you decide, but it's still one service. In other words, the code that is deployed is one thing. It doesn't have to be multiple code deployed in multiple places. Do you get what I mean?
No, we're on two different. We're talking about two different things.
So
No,
so
no, no, no. You're talking about technology that needs to scale. I'm talking about people that need to scale. If you want to get to market ASAP,
mhm.
the people problem is the most complex problem to solve.
But you don't
And
even have that many people to begin with. That's my argument,
my argument is it
right?
depends on what you're building.
My argument is regardless of what you're building as a startup, you don't have that many people as a startup. If you have more than 50 engineers, you are not a startup anymore.
Okay.
Think about it. Because just think about it. Can you give me an example, one example of a startup that is still new, still trying to make money, and has over 100 engineers?
Yeah.
Okay, give me an example. Like which one?
It's the department that's responsible for building HoloLens.
But that's inside Microsoft.
Microsoft is nothing but a whole bunch of companies under the umbrella called Microsoft.
But do you see what's going on here? That means that okay, I can come up with a counter example of my own.
That's like saying Skunk Works. Like in theory, like, and I'm being devil's advocate, but in theory, you have departments or you have cells within a monolithic organization that run autonomously that can cultivate startup like behavior in order to get their projects out to market.
Okay, I get you. I understand. And another example could be it doesn't even have to be inside of Microsoft, right? Like you gave the example of OpenAI itself, right? Can be considered a startup, right? You just got like huge amount of funding out of the blue. And with that amount of funding, you went and you hired a huge amount of developers, right? Then it may make more sense to have like a microservice approach, which means I
Meta,
agree. Yeah, I agree with what
metaverse.
you. Yeah, like metaverse or whatever. I agree with what you're saying. In the sense that the choice of microservices is to scale with the people that are working on it. That is actually correct. But where I'm coming from, right, is that is not the so where I'm coming from is most startups aren't like that. Most startups are one person has a good idea, hires a bunch of people, even if they get huge amounts of funding initially, right? There's still a bunch of people. So the mindset that the example I'm thinking of in my head is Silicon Valley movie series. Have you seen that series, Silicon Valley?
No.
Okay, so in Silicon Valley series, it's like maybe 8 or 9 developers or so that are building this, Web 3.0, blah blah blah, and they got a ton of funding, and so that's who my mind is looking at. In other words, the distance between me and the person that I'm working with is maybe we're just sitting side by side. I can just walk to him and say, "Hey, can you have this thing done by this?" Or we're all working on one thing. Then you don't need to build microservices. That's dumb, right?
We're on
It,
the same page.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's dumb to do that because you're essentially because the overhead of coordinating the microservice beats the advantage of separating it. It's better everything is in one place. You have one debugging stack. If something goes wrong, you can easily trace it in one place, etc., etc. If you're a big company, that's what I call big company here. Like you have more than 50 developers. Go ahead and use your microservices. That's what will make sense for you. But if you're a small company, aka startup, like a few developers, you have no business doing microservices. And the irony, and this is what makes my blood boil. The irony is that the chat GPTs, the open AIs, the people who actually have a proper incentive to go microservices aren't often the ones that do the microservices. The ones that do the microservices are the quote unquote mom and pop startups that are like 10 developers that have one service for every goddamn thing. And one developer is working on 4 or 5 services at any given point in time. To me, that's just dumb. That's just plain dumb. Right? So,
I mean, tech. It's yes, it's dumb when it comes to the technical approach of what is required.
mhm,
Jamie Edwards was right, man. It all goes back to incentives.
yeah.
When 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 I was building the mobile order fulfillment for this Beach Mobile thing, I'm a lone developer and I have a dozen function apps, right? Each
Mm,
function app has like half a dozen to a dozen Azure functions in it, right? So
okay.
I have a distributed microservice architecture. Why did I do that, Odie? Why,
Why?
why did I do that?
Yeah.
I'll tell you.
Okay.
Because I realized that it's a high probability that the passion project that I've been working on for the past 4 years is going to fail. But it's a slight probability that it may attract some interest, it may attract some funding, but it's very likely it's going to fail. But if I work on it, and if I can't get 140, $150 an hour being a cloud architect because I don't have any experience
Hmm.
from an organization, then how do I get experience? Well, I'll just do it on my passion project, and no one can deny that I didn't implement Azure this, Azure that, whether it's Azure Functions or Azure, I don't know all the names within their portfolio of tools, but I was incentivized for financial gain to uh, enhance my resume by demonstrating
Hmm.
the skill set through the passion project that I'm working on. And I would imagine going back to mom and pops that in order for them to be competitive in the marketplace, they probably believe that they need to say that they have experience or their portfolio includes something that really wasn't relevant for their product or service. But to be marketed to the human factor, they believe it's necessary.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, so this goes back to like you said, incentive, but for me, I think it's more along the lines of objectives, right? Now, if one of your objectives is longevity, right? If one of your objective is even skill set, I want to gain certain skill set from this thing, then sure. But if your objective, if you say that your objective to is to build a is to build is to go to market as quickly as possible, then I would strongly argue that going microservices is just not in your best interest. And the reason it's not in your best interest is because what tends to happen is that there's this concept where I work, right, of one-way and two-way doors. Right. A one-way door is a change that is when it's made, you can't go back on. Right. So when you decide that we're going to do this thing, there is no going back. Versus some decisions that you can always go back. So don't spend your time, don't spend your energy trying to overthink or over architect a solution that you can always reverse on. And the choice of monolith versus microservice is a classic example of that. Granted, like if you build a microservice, if you start with microservices, bringing them back into a monolith is painful. It's more painful than if you started with a monolith, and splitting it out into microservices is much easier, right? And you want to make sure that your cadence, especially in the beginning, nothing is impeding that cadence. So that's my argument against going microservices. Now, are there logical boundaries between software that could require you to have two separate services for them? Sure. But that shouldn't be your default. That should be the exception. And what I see most times in startups is that that's the default. Oh, we are using this microservice architecture. We're going to build.
It's a default for political reasons so that people can have financial gain and for people to be in a better position to take care of themselves and their families.
Hmm.
That's it.
That's it, really. Yeah. 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 Hmm. So, what's the? So, can we summarize?
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm going to butcher this.
Okay.
Does the technology stack matter for a startup? Yes. However, the business needs to be very careful that their business objectives and how it gets and the execution to manifest that or to realize that does not conflict with the incentives of the human beings that are predicated on making that happen or delivering it.
Hmm.
Um, People need to feed themselves and their family, and if there's an opportunity for them to use your business as a vehicle to get to a higher paying job based on them demonstrating a new skill set that you never asked for, but they're going to take it as an opportunity to pad their resume at the expense of your business, then I think history has proven that people will do that. I've done it. Okay. So I'll pause there, and then I guess we can keep going back and forth on
No, no,
summarizing the rest of it.
no, no. You're right, and you're right about that in the sense that now that I think about it, looking back, most of the reasons people chose, I saw small startups using microservices was because they had one or two passionate engineers who just wanted to put it on their resume. Oh, we built microservices and stuff like that. Not because there was a need for it, right? And this usually comes at the expense of the business. There are a few things that I will, in fact, I'm even thinking of making a video very soon on, just architecture details, right? And some of the nonsense that I've seen, because going from failed projects to failed projects to failed project, there are certain patterns I've seen, and there are certain things I know don't work, right? And yet we still do them. And the reason we still do them is because there are some developers who are incentivized to just do the wrong thing, and it doesn't matter as long as they get to
Feature
pack their
patching.
food.
I'm sorry. I'm congested.
Yeah, so that's something that's something that I would like to talk about in another video. But anyway, long story short is, summary is, does technology stack matter? Yes. You have to think long and hard before selecting your technology stack as a startup, right? You have to balance the long term maintainability of your startup versus um, the initial acceleration in progress that you get from certain tools. And not all tools have the same profile. So that's something you really need to think through. And just to make a call out, we had a video on, technologies to learn. So it's still kind of related to this, right? Technologies to learn in 2023 or something like that. So if you haven't, you can go check out that video.
Which
So,
is the best performing video that we have.
oh really? I didn't check that, but yeah, that's cool to know. That's cool to know.
I don't have anything else. Like,
Yeah. So yeah,
subscribe, share in that order.
yeah. So bye, guys.
Peace.